thanks everyone for coming out, joining all the way here to Aspen to be with us for this evening. And this is going to be, we're thinking about it as kind of an intimate conversation about art, the making of art, and how these particular artists, since we're showing their work, go about thinking about their work and how they do it. So it's going to be kind of a much more freewheeling discussion, although I did have a couple of questions for these guys. So is there anything you guys want to say before we get started?
Thank you to everyone coming, and also thank you to Sam and the Aspen Collective for hosting this show and taking a chance on us and putting us together.
Yeah.
Because we never imagined showing together, and it's really been lovely.
I know. I second exactly that. This has been really, really special.
What I really loved about these guys is that they started having a conversation between themselves about showing together, which is, for me, always a great thing to get out of the way to let the art move forward. So I kind of feel my role, one of my roles, is to kind of just present a stage for the art to happen and exist in. So if you don't know me, one of the things that I really love doing is curating shows, putting artists together, and again, getting out of the way so that they have a voice that goes out into the world. And on the flip side of that, I also have questions as a curator, and I'm also a maker. So one of the things I was curious about is you make these objects and these paintings and these non-verbal messages. So how do you, when you're working, what are your intentionalities? I'll just start with you, Lindsey.
Oh God. Okay. The first thing I thought of as you started talking about it was the idea that within my work, I write a lot, but then I realize it scratches the surface in terms of what I'm actually trying to talk about. I deal a lot in the like unspeakable or things that can't be articulated with language. A lot of it is about just evoking specific feelings that are not necessarily tied to particular material conditions and things like that.
What do you mean material conditions?
Representation. Physical representations and things, or physical, very, very specific human situations as well. Sometimes it's broader than that.
Could you elaborate a little bit more? I'm still kind of lost.
I am too. I don't remember what I said. No, I don't remember what I said. No, it's you'd have to say it back to me.
She'll figure it out when she watches the talk.
Probably not. It'll probably be huh?
You said material conditions. So let's just pick that apart.
Oh God.
Unpack that. Material conditions. Do you mean the material of the paint on the panel?
Physical real-world conditions.
Physical real-world conditions.
Yeah, real world, non-painting world.
Okay.
Situations between people and
More so, yeah.
Okay. And then how is that reflected in looking at the work?
I want within my work to be far less direct than I could be, I'll say, in terms of the things that I'm discussing specifically, within my own self. I don't necessarily want people to be able to read into it exactly in the way that I am describing it in my own head. I want people to just take their own read, apply their own situations to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So setting up parameters in which a person can move around a little bit.
Yeah, line people up for a specific line of thought, but don't tell them everything. Let them fill in the gaps, and their gaps are their own, and that's what makes their experience of the work special.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Savanna, how would you?
Intentionality of my work. I feel like I work very intuitively. The reason I work with clay is it's grounding and I love the tactile nature of it. This specific work in this show is expanding on a few bodies, but this opportunity allowed me to dig into some things, and it's the first time that I've had a chance since being a fellow of the Aspen Art Museum, where I had the epiphany that all my work is drawing regardless of the material, the physical material. So looking at these like voids and negative spaces and those being kind of more zoomed into these basket forms, it's very intuitive in terms of making.
So the intentionality is intuitive. And then how do you filter in audience response?
I feel like I'm making the work for me. It's how I'm processing the world and how we're all connected, and that's why there's so many grids and structure, and that's how I'm processing things. So there's these wonderful moments when people start to interact with it and they have questions, but it's not necessarily the intention of the making to get to that point. I'm not trying to elicit a specific response from people. I want them to approach the work and experience the work based on their own, where they're from.
Okay.
I'm not trying to guide it so specifically. I think we're kind of similar in that way. Yeah.
All right, so since we have a small audience, does anyone have any input or questions about response?
Really?
It's like you have some, well, this might be silly, but it seems like your animals are ones that elicit a lot of meaning for a lot of people. I mean, I think there's like a whole play about cicadas in New York right now, and I'm like, do you do that purposefully? Try to elicit strong emotions through the things you pick purposefully, or is it just things that come to you?
A lot of what I pick imagery-wise kind of speaks to universal like tropes or associations, yeah. Sometimes it comes from like specific stories and research that I've read into, but ultimately like I want it to be about just like surface level kind of feeling the way that I'm trying to get at, so yeah.
Do you feel like
Could you take some of those generalizations and apply them to any one of your pieces that are in the show and to talk more specifically about it?
I could say what I'll like talk about is like the like longest standing like generalization symbol that I've used within my work, which is like rabbits. Where those like originally came from, when I started figuring out what my work was, it was all exclusively imagery of prey animals. And it was all about like fear, running from the unknown, like always like being chased by death almost is like stuff that I was always thinking about. Fear of death was something I was always thinking about with my work. But then it evolved, and specifically like rabbits almost became like a gentle fighter character. Yeah, that's the biggest thing that I do within my work though. There are plenty of other things. It's just like the quickest one that I can think of to describe. Yeah.
This is so interesting because like talking about, I mean, making work is such an intimate process, right? And so thank you guys for being here and being willing to go through this, because to be kind of put on the spot, like to answer a question about your process is a kind of revealing thing to do. So I don't like doing it. I'm pretty decent at it, but it does ask you to like reveal yourself on the spot. So thank you for being here to answer these intimate questions.
Well, thank you for pushing us to do so.
Yeah, it's not natural for me. Thanks for making me do it though. It's a good
It's
exercise.
it's like thinking while you're doing. Because doing and thinking are such separate things in terms of making work. When you're when you physically have your materials in front of you, whatever they are, it's like you're reacting to your thinking, but then when you are not doing it, it's a completely different engagement, right? Do we have anyone else?
I had a question for both of you kind of about the forms and the like line quality in your case, Lindsey. Like, why are you drawn to the almost like graphic, like flattening of images? Like, where do you draw inspiration from that choice? And then for you, like these shapes, like what about these shapes are you drawn to?
Well, I'll say it started not being very profound. It was just that like I love the aesthetics of contemporary culture. I love the aesthetics of cartoons and of screen printing and just like our whole graphic world that we live within. It was all about like making beautiful images initially. But then I realized so much of my work, especially in recent years, has been all about like my age and where I'm at in my life in this point in time, this point in history, with all like global conditions that we're considering all together. So what I think is most important about what I'm doing graphically in terms of like line quality, color, flatness, is all about like this is work that's being made right now. This like the year 2024. It's like kind of undeniable that it was made like now or slightly earlier than now. Like I'm kind of like separate from the timeless, I would say. Yeah.
How would you, Savanna, how would you respond to the word graphic?
In relation to my work?
Yeah.
Well, I feel like my background is drawing and painting. And so if you look at my functional pots, there's a lot of drawing and graphic elements and design. When you approach us for this show and knowing Lindsey's work, I kind of wanted to let the form speak and tone down the actual graphics on the surface of my pots. So it's like, I'm gonna have these raw pieces, no glaze in the middle, and everything else is gonna be glazed black. And let the voids of these shapes speak. And so I think that does have a graphic element, but it's very different than my other work.
What I love about that is like the power of that tonality of color as a single like entity. Like there's like, instead of having lots of color, it kind of emanates from its almost solidity of like void, which is kind of interesting, like to see something that's a void that's a solid object.
Yeah, solidity of void, that was nice.
So
It's like what's there and what's not there.
So, because I sit, well, of course, because I'm here all day, I'm sitting here going, what am I looking at? And how does it live in the world? And then I watch people approach it, and it's so odd. You know, like seeing a hand go into that basket or something like that, which is why I put some oranges in that one, because it really makes the experience dramatic in a way.
Yeah. Another big thing for me with these pieces are the shadow play. And so depending on the lighting situation and whether or not it's daytime and sun's coming in, it's the cast shadow, and especially in the basket forms, these intersections of those lines.
Anyone else?
I'm really curious, Savanna, if you could talk a little bit about, we could piggyback on William's question about form. Are you approaching these with the thought of how they're going to function first, or are you thinking about the form and the texture first? Like, which one is more important for you when you're coming up with your idea?
Well, the bench in the middle of the room is unique from everything else, and this plays on some of the installation work I've done, and it's all about the power of multiples. But it's also like, the kiln is only so big, and how do I make big work? So there's a little bit of both. Like, I want it to be able to be rearranged, but it's also easier on my body as the maker to be making something this size. In terms of the other pieces, you know, I started off throwing, and I really didn't like it. I was like stuck in the round. And I know you can take a thing off the wheel and manipulate it, but there's something about rolling a slab and cutting a shape And that's the starting place. That's what I'm pushing up against. And I've been drawn to these like oblong shapes, in part based on my own home and where I have space on a windowsill or whatnot, and it's expanded from there. Now when I look at this shape, this feels somehow like a mirror to me. So that's why it's held reflection. And then, you know, these other pieces go up, and that same oblong shape is then repeated as the void or the thing that's cut out. So just that repetition and power of multiples, and yeah.
Interesting.
And they're heavy forms though. I mean, the ones here are somewhere between architecture and landscape. And they're very heavy, the glaze that you've chosen for them. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that choice. Like what, I know you talked about the raw clay,
Yeah.
but why this color? What draws you to that?
So going back a number of years, I had a lot of color in my work, and I felt like I was tied up in the decision of what I was making and then how I was decorating it, and I eliminated all color. And so now I have a black glaze, a white glaze, and the color of the clay body. So for this, like I had mentioned before, for this show, knowing Lindsey's work and not wanting to compete and wanting to have a graphic quality that was different, keeping with the black. But it also has this sense of void and space and other. And so sometimes when I look through the pieces in that negative space, I imagine it being the same color as the glaze, or, you know, how does that shadow interplay and how does that change how you view it?
It's almost part of the question I was going to answer is like, how do you guys respond to the notion of hue or color? You go first.
I'm thinking.
Well, I can piggyback on what I was
Do you want to
saying,
piggyback?
if
You go
want.
first. I'm
Yeah.
processing.
So I think the beauty about this black glaze, which it was given to me, someone in the studio had a bucket and was like, I don't use black, and was like, here, you will use this. And I didn't have a recipe, so I had to hunt it down and find it. But I do think the way that it overlaps on itself and where it gets thick versus thin, and if you see it in the sunshine, it sparkles. So it's quite lovely, and it's not this, it's flat, but it's not flat. And I think that's what's great about this glaze, and I'm probably going to stick with it for a while.
Actually, someone came in today and asked me, how does she glaze these? And I said, I have no idea.
I made a ton of it and filled a plastic tote and dunked the whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was trying to visualize it. I thought, well, maybe she glazes one half and then the other half.
There is a little bit of that happening. So when you look at some of the pieces, there's a bisect line, and that is the overlap happening. So I am strategic about how I dip, so that line is kind of, you know, I'm making a choice about where that's going to show up.
Right. It's pretty obvious when you look at the work, but I had nothing to tell them.
A really big vat of glaze.
No, because they said, well, do you think she sprays it?
No, I mean, I wish. I would totally try that if I had a spray booth, but I don't.
Right, Lindsey.
Okay. What I thought about in the last couple minutes when you were talking. One of the big things that I'm doing with color, I realize it comes from a design standpoint. Like my background is in illustration. A lot of my work comes from a digital place, but a lot of what I'm doing, because in the grand scheme of what you see in painting right now, my work isn't massive. It's mid-scale. So something that I'm doing graphically is trying to do that 20, 30 feet away draw, and ask people to come into it. That's something that I do on a graphic level, on a very basic surface level in terms of what I do with color. Otherwise, though, people have asked me before, does an individual color mean something? I'm gonna go with no. A lot of, I don't know, what is the role of pink specifically? I like it. I like it. But no, I mean.
Does it invoke a feeling in you, when you see pink, and why your hair is pink.
Yeah, yes.
That's
yeah.
the feeling.
Yes, but no. A lot of it is like okay, the like way that one of the main ways that I describe myself as a painter, and this is kind of like stupid, I call myself like a feminine rage painter. So a lot of what I want to do is like simultaneously make stuff that is like really heavy, but also very conventionally feminine, but also like has weight, has punch, but it is also feminine.
This is
That's a
really
big thing to do.
interesting because I don't see a kind of, from my perspective, a kind of conventional feminist, or not feminist, but feminine quality.
I don't want it to be conventional.
Yeah. Did you say conventional?
I don't want it to be conventional. I just want it to be like evocative of that.
Okay.
Generally.
Because I was like, I don't see conventional.
It's not. I don't think it is, and I'm glad that you say that.
Okay.
That's validating, actually.
I mean, 'cause this thing just it vibrates.
It really
Yeah.
does.
It vibrates, and I love the fact that you brought up that 20-foot thing.
Yeah, just like the distance draw thing.
Right? Because
Yeah.
from outside, when you see it from outside, it has as much vibrational quality as it does when you're like inches away from it. The details change, of course, but then there's this kind of thing that emanates from the structure and color and the relationship of color.
Yeah. One thing I'll say about like this specific painting too, in terms of color, I feel like I was playing a lot within like the grotesque in terms of colors with this one. I was like, I started from this yellow, and from my perspective, most of the time this yellow is kind of nasty. So I started with it and built all the colors around it, and all the relativity was like very, very challenging in terms of making something that made sense altogether.
So when you work on something like this, how often did you change the color of these flowers? Or was it like
45 million times.
Okay.
Yeah. No, a lot of it, especially was in these greens. The greens were nuts, but it's like, yeah, a lot of it though is just trying to bridge colors that aren't supposed to be together. That's something I do a lot, I'll say.
Bridge colors that aren't supposed to be together.
Yeah.
I can see
think
that.
dissonance is the key for me in that feminist language. Because
I want some bizarre.
That's a refusal, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And for me, like, I look at that and it's an urn. It also looks like hell to me. You know, like you're burning in hell.
Okay, that's kind of where my work started. Yeah. It's gotten less like hit you over the head with the whole hell aspect, but it's about that.
I'm glad you brought this one up because this is the one that makes me work harder to think about because of it's iterations of red and pink. So there's not a whole lot of other color to kind of compare within the framework of the piece. So it's really, so I find myself trying to understand it a lot. So, because that one is not easy, but easier because there's so much going on.
There's more to latch onto.
More to latch onto. But this one is like, it's all red in there. So.
Yeah. I like the idea of delving further into giving people less and less and less to go off of, even if it is like very, very rendered and crisp. I like that thought, just like fewer variables for people to like be able to associate with personally.
And so when I was thinking about putting people together, I have a list. I have this list. I make these lists, right? And then I go A, B, I do that kind of juggling thing. And I went, Savanna and Lindsey. Wow. Okay. Let's see what that's going to look like. And because selfishly, a lot of this it has to do with me looking and learning, to be honest, as a curator and someone who puts things together. And I wanted to see how these two, how their thinking kind of came together or not, right? So And I like that. I love that about thinking about objects in relationship to paintings and how the two people kind of converse. Anybody else with?
You know, I mean, generalized, Lindsay, you use a lot of red, not just in that one, but you know,
It's
there's red and very strong red in almost anything.
Mhm.
Would you comment about that?
I mean, a lot of it is about like the intensity factor, like the lack of like, I guess like the inability to settle and be calm within my work. That's something that really matters to me, is just like creating a general sense of unrest, even if it's like non-specific and it's not really pointed anywhere. That's something. But then another thing too is just like, graphically, I started working with red as a line tone because I didn't want to line my work in black. That is like the non-conceptual side of it. It's almost, I have this thing in my studio. It's like I have this little thing hung up in my studio, just as like rules for the studio, and that's one of them, is like I don't line things in black, which means I line things in red or in blue. So that's kind of my boring answer, but generally I'm speaking to intensity and weight though. Kind of in the same way that I'm using black too. I feel like they kind of take the same role, anything that's dark and heavy. Mm-hmm.
Then I have a question for you, Sam.
Yes.
So comparing the palette that Lindsay uses versus the palette that Savanna is showing in these pieces,
Right.
talk about that. Because they, you know.
Well, I don't think you knew when you
what the work
put
was
us
going to be.
together.
Yeah.
I had a sense.
You had a sense.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with both your works. So I have a sense.
Well, I don't mean that you're unfamiliar, but I use a lot of white in my work, and none of that is here. You know.
What was your question again?
Well, just you know, when you were talking about how you thought the two of them would go together, and yet the palettes that they use, even if you include, you know, Savanna's white and her black and everything else, it's very different.
A lot of it had to do with what goes within a frame, right? So I think about the frame, and for me, frame equates shape. So I was thinking about the shape of Savanna's work in relationship to the frames within Lindsey's work. So I was thinking about how they both frame what is to be looked at and engaged with, right? Look at the piece behind Leah. Look, that is a great frame, the blue area.
Right.
And then if you look at this piece, right, as a void, it also frames space.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking about the framing of space and then what goes inside that frame.
Okay.
And okay, let's see what happens. And then I get to sit here and look at it and think about it. So again, it's super self-feeding in a way, right? Because, and as I said earlier, art is a kind of non-verbal form of communication, right? So when I get to be in here with these things by myself, or even when other people come in and engage with them, I get to see their reaction to what they're experiencing. And I get to think about my engagement with the process of making art as well, right? So, yeah.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Oh, we're not going on film, are we? This is a commercial pitch.
Okay.
Savannah just dropped some objects off at the Buyer Center store,
Oh, cool.
and they're nothing like what's in the gallery. And I was in there yesterday, and they are stunning. And I was thinking, am I having tea out of this art object, which is a cup but it is so much more.
Right.
And they fit beautifully in the buyer center. So I urge everyone to get over there and have a look at it. It's a great experience.
Before they disappear.
But the work is very different from what's in here, but really exquisite. So,
Thank you so much.
And that's really great. Which then, so how would you guys respond to the word intimacy?
I feel like making my work is a very intimate act. I mean, it's me and the work, me and the clay. I'm not really thinking about other people in that mix.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Right?
No, I mean, it feels secondary. It
Okay.
doesn't feel primary.
Okay. Because you're gonna, I mean, if you're making utilitarian objects, you kind of have to think about like someone's response to being able to pick it up or wash it or clean it or use it or whatever. So there's got to be some of that. So it's secondary. Is what
Yeah,
you said.
yeah.
Okay. Intimacy.
Okay. Personal level, I'll say like the way in which I'm really intimate with my work is like the early phases of it. Most of the time my work begins with the concept before the images are fully solidified. Sometimes there's images in mind, but it's all centered around what am I trying to talk about. Sometimes it comes from like research, looking at symbols, where it comes from within the world. And then within these paintings, I spend more time planning and sketching them than I do painting them sometimes. At the very least, it's half-half. So that is a big thing for me. Even though I don't call myself like a process artist, it's like my work wouldn't be what it is if I didn't have like this working relationship with it at the same time. But in terms of like the intimacy of it as it goes out into the world, that's like the more interesting part to me, because it's more difficult for me to pin down. But one of my favorite things that I experience within my work is like people telling me, like looking at my work and telling me like incredibly vulnerable things about themselves that they were willing to uncover when seeing what I'm making. Yeah, that's really, really special to me. That while like my work comes from hard places all the time, I just really enjoy being able to like share other people's hard times, kind of bear some of that weight with my work. It's cool. Unexpected, like very cool benefit of what I do. Mm-hmm.
Anybody want to respond or have a question about that?
I'm wondering, do you feel like when you're working on a piece that it's kind of like a diary or like similar to like writing for yourself kind of moment?
I think so, yeah. In terms of like the internal dialogue, that is not important to me whatsoever, whether or not it gets shared.
Yeah.
I want the generalizations of it to carry through and kind of spread along to people that look at it and relate to it. But I kind of like it better when people don't know everything about me and they look at my work. Yeah. I
think a lot of artists feel that way.
I think when you know everything about me and you can figure out what everything's about, it gets kind of like not as exciting. So, yeah.
Wait, one more question I'm going to ask you guys, and that's it.
And that's it.
So, how about personal influences on your work, like historical references, or what have you looked at in the past, or now that kind of influences the dialogue you have as an artist?
It's a laundry list for me.
You can go with short.
Yeah, I'll say like kind of like tracing back into art history, like the Northern Renaissance, like Japanese woodblock. Those are like the historical things that I love, like either graphically or conceptually or both. That is like the beginning of it all, and then it gets like in terms of like it's that, and then it's like the very contemporary. That's the thing. I love design. I love graphic design. I love. I don't know that I love. I just am totally influenced by how much just general stuff we look at every day, like on the internet. how much just like crosses our mental space every single day. A lot of what I do is like about the overload of that actually, but like that's an influence, but also I have a bazillion different artists that I love who are working today. I love like Nat Power, Zcam, Christian Van Minnen. Who else do I love? I mean, why is my brain like going totally stale? It's funny because
you're on the spot.
I'm on the spot. I know. I like did a Zoom interview with somebody and just rattled off people the other day. But yeah, that's something for me. I have been. I was told by like a guest lecturer when I was in school for illustration that when you are working on really important stuff in your work, that you should not look at other people's work at all, that you should let your work exist within a vacuum, and I totally disagree with that. I think people are really afraid of their work being derivative, and it's like, baby, everything's derivative. It's just like, just don't make it be more derivative than other things. And then you're okay. So like that's where I'm at, is just like I spend a lot of time looking at stuff to a point that I'm like where do I even narrow it down to?
I feel like maybe I used to be more like that, especially in the academic setting, but these days maybe I'm more in the vacuum sense. I'm taking a lot of time to reflect on like why am I actually making what I'm making, and so with that, it's observing the world around us. For me, it's a lot of shadow play, and so all of these objects create a moment of happenstance when it's interacting with something else, and hopefully the viewer is seeing that and that sparks something within them. So less looking at a lot of other people's work and more about our natural surroundings, and just taking a moment of pause to look at things, and then how am I gonna embed that into the work and create those moments, almost like an intermediary, if you will.
But if you're gonna pick a few visual mentors from your past, or from art history or literature or any of that, who comes up?
Well, I mean, the first name that comes to mind is this bench was made in a class with one of my contemporaries, Kelsey Rudolph. She makes ceramic furniture. So I learned a lot from this person, and then took that and was like, I don't want to make giant things. I want to make it modular and small that I can handle. But then like pulling from my background of drawing and painting, and how I draw is hatching and cross hatching, and looking at some printmaking and intaglio and things like that, that comes into these forms, these like lattice basketry, where I'm building the piece solid and then I'm taking away most of it.
Well, thank you guys for being so open